Hi guys, girls, the network. This is a quick 3 minute dive into GDPR, which comes into force this week. So I've put together this little presentation so as you can go through it multiple times if you want to, but hopefully you'll get a slightly better understanding what GDPR is as a result of this presentation. So quickly getting into it. Legislation has some serious implications. Don't laugh about it, as crazy it all sounds and as ridiculous it all may seem. I think there are some good bits to it, but it's the laborious nature of what we have to get used to is the thing that's sort of putting everyone off. And at the end of the day, no one really knows how the ICO are going to enforce it, but there are fines should you fall foul of the legislation. So nothing to be scoffed at. None of us want to be fined for any implications of not following what good practice looks like. And it's all around processing of personal data, not business data, personal data. But just be careful with that thing about personal data. It's people in businesses as much as it's sort of the domestic customer consumer. So sending it to Sean Taylor at the Forces Group could be seen as an infringement on data protection, whereas sending it to info@ would not be. And don't forget that with sole traders, sole traders are people, so that would be regarded as personal data as well. And in basic sense, there is change coming to make sure that everyone takes care of this data. I think in the past, although there's been data protection laws out for many years, this is tightening up and making sure that there's good practice, good housekeeping for keeping data. And please remember, this is not just about digital data. This is physical data, written data, video data, anything where an individual can be identified with personal details could be regarded as falling under this legislation. So don't, it's quite wide ranging. So just getting on quickly, the key terms, just so you know: data protection officer, we don't have one. We don't need one. So anyone who says who's your data protection officer, we don't have one. The data controller, what we're doing with this whole project is we're looking at it as a sort of an umbrella set of documents to use and adopt through all our businesses. So the Forces Group, through Pestforce, Lockforce, Washforce, and obviously through the franchise network. We're saying the data compliance, or we've nominated Paul as the data compliance manager. So if there's any issues or anyone needs to contact, there's contact details for that. In terms of data processes in our business, obviously we as franchisors have the employees that process data. You yourselves as franchisees process data, and potentially suppliers and advisors do. So, when we're looking at referencing to data processes, that's what we mean. And then in terms of data subjects, we're talking about the actual people to which this legislation is there to protect. So, if you look at it in its sort of main source, it's talking about our customers or our prospects, but obviously our employees and our franchisees are also data subjects, depending on the relationship and what transaction we're talking about. So actually all of us are involved and implicated in this new legislation on both sides of the coin. So the documentation that we're putting in place and sending out to you guys, we've got the data protection policy. That is the overarching document that says how we as the data controller, the brand, handles data through our network. With our employees, with our franchisees, with our subcontractors. So that's the overarching policy. We have that in the business. We're sending it out to you guys, so you guys adopt exactly the same policy. Obviously, if we have a data protection policy, we also need to have a data breach policy. So in the event of something going wrong, data loss, data breach, data theft, we have a policy and a response plan. While we're issuing you this data breach policy, we see it as our responsibility to make sure it happens. So it's probably about us working with you to make sure that any data breach is followed up properly and potentially reported to the ISO. Then we have 3 privacy notices. So we have the data protection policy out there. We have a privacy notice, one with our staff, one with our franchisees, and one with our customers. And what the privacy notice says is what data we hold on you, what we're going to do with it, and why or how we're going to hold it, how long we're going to hold it for. So we have one with staff, dealing with staff matters, one with franchisees dealing with franchisee matters, and then the more important one, I think, which although all of them are important, but in terms of our trading with our customers and our prospects, there's a privacy notice. And the way we're going to issue this is staff will get a privacy notice, franchisees will get a privacy notice, and then we'll put a privacy notice onto our website and probably stitch it into the ops system to make sure it's referenced properly. And then we also have data processing conditions. So this is where people are using data that we have collected, and we have these processing conditions in place for our franchisees and our suppliers. Two other documents or two other bits of data or documents you need to be aware of is, as a business, we're assessing everything in terms of data processing, and we're keeping a record of it. This is good practice. We don't have to do it, but it's going to be some good practice. And then in the event of people actually asking for data access, in other words, if individuals want to get access to their data or ask it to be removed, we have some forms and letters to deal with that process. And we really see the head office here acting as a conduit to make sure all this happens, liaising with you, but probably making sure and controlling that these things happen. Moving on, because I have probably just under 3 minutes to do this. The guiding principles, 7 guiding principles of the data privacy. It talks about processing it fairly and lawfully. This is all about fairful and lawfully. There are lawful reasons for collecting data. So you have to have a reason to collect the data. You have to process it proportionally. What that means, you have to only collect the data that's relevant for what you need it to do. You can't ask for the inside leg measurement of somebody if you don't need it. So it's all about being relevant and adequate. It's not. You don't have to do chapter and verse. If you're contracting with a customer, you need the key bits of data in order that transaction to happen. You don't need any more. It's about keeping the data accurate and up to date. That's nothing more than good housekeeping. If you don't need the data anymore, you need to potentially get rid of it. So very clear distinction here is customers. We've transacted with a customer, maybe only once, but we sent them an invoice. They paid us money. We need to hold that data for some time. We can't just go and delete it. Whereas maybe a prospect who's inquired about our services has never taken up our services, there'll be questions to how long we need to hold that data before we get rid of it. And we're not actually looking at getting rid of data. We're looking at normalizing it, which would mean it's legal we can then hold that data. So we're not losing some of the reporting stats that we need. Making sure it's processed in accordance with data subjects and with the Act. That's just making sure following the right processes. I'm not going to go into the detail of that now. I think the first 5 and number 7 are really relevant. And number 7 is about the technical and organizational methods. This is about making sure we have physical and non-physical protection in place. So don't think this is just digital. This is digital and paper. So if you've got paper, do you lock it away? How do you stop people getting access to it? If it's digital, have you got passwords in place? Have you got firewalls? Do you back up the data? Do you back it up securely? Which other people have access to your data? So there's lots of things to think about, and it will be something stupid that happens that potentially could lead to a data loss. It could be losing your mobile phone and not having a PIN number on it. That could be seen as a real problem. So 7 guiding principles to look at. 6 bases. So we talk about holding or taking data for the legal reason for holding it. 1 is consent, which means the person says you can use this data for what you said you're going to use it for. You cannot collect data, get consent for one purpose and use it for another purpose. The 3 ones that we're looking at are contract, because they're customers, legal obligation, because we have a legal obligation to hold that data, and in some instances legitimate interest in terms of customer care, follow-up, reviews, etc. So they're the 3 highlighted ones that we're going to use. And we'll get into consent if we start getting into the marketing and etc. What are we doing? We've made this simple presentation to try and make life easier and to show you what's happening. We've set up a set of group documents for everybody to adopt so that we're all using the same documents. It's all congruent. And we're going to send an email out with the links to all those forms. We're about to update the privacy notices on our website. updating the ops system to comply with GDPR. There's a couple of small tweaks we need to make to make it more compliant with GDPR. And we're carrying out an overview of all these data processing activities just to check that there aren't any big holes. It's all good practice. We're in the process of training head office staff. This is in the process of beginning to train you guys and give you some advice. And, with regard to franchisees, we're also going to be writing out to you with your privacy notice. So the relationship between us as franchisor and you as franchisee. So what do you need to do? Do spend a bit of time getting a better understanding of GDPR legislation. There are some simple guides out there. There's also a lot of rubbish in terms of what you should and shouldn't do. Lots of there's conjecture and contrary advice. But I think what we've got is a fairly solid approach that should cover all bases. And then obviously once the legislation comes into force and people see how it's being regulated, there may be further changes. Read what I send out. If you read what I send out, you'll get a much better idea of what you need to do. We will probably ask you to sign and return some documents, but just sending them out would be enough in most instances to have an explicit or an implicit agreement. If you've got employment, we'll give you some further instructions to just copy what we're doing with our staff here at head office. And ultimately, if you have any questions, please just ask. So you might get questions from your customers. Generally speaking, get them written down so it's very clear what they're asking for. Once they're written down, then you can seek some further advice from us. Just remember, a customer is if a customer is on our books, they may start asking lots of questions. They're firstly legitimately allowed to ask what data we hold on them, but they can't think that we can delete that data because obviously they're a customer and we have an entitlement to hold that data. And if you do get a request to delete or see the data, then just refer it to us. We can give you clear advice or maybe able to do it for you. If someone says, what's your policy and process? Well, you can refer them to the documents that we're providing. Now, in the event of a breach of data, hopefully it doesn't happen. But if so, if you suspect a possible breach or loss of data, then report it to us immediately. If you actually refer to the document we send out called GDPR Data Breach Policy, you'll have a better understanding of what does that look like. And what will happen is if we do have a suspected data breach, we will lead the response. We'll guide you and help you. You'll need to be involved in that, but we'll lead it essentially just to make sure that we cover all the bases. But just in summary, don't ignore the legislation. You'd be a fool to ignore it. Don't worry about it either, but as long as you are protecting the data with those principles that we talked about earlier, understand it a bit. The more you understand it, then the easier and the simpler it is for you to actually do your day-to-day job without worrying about it. Treat data with real care and attention. Where do you lock your invoice books? If you're using invoice books, we would strongly suggest to do away with invoice books. It's very antiquated. It's very old school. It's a way that the government are moving into digitalization. So I think all of us have to move that way. But an invoice, a service report, anything like that could be regarded as personal data. So just be careful. There we go. Adequate steps, physical security, locking things away, password protection, very day to day, very sort of common sense things that should happen. Read the documents we sent out. I've said that twice now, so please do read them. Go through GDPR with your staff. If you do have staff, they don't have to know the ins and outs of it, but people may ask them, so make sure they understand there is this legislation, GDPR. It's about protecting customer information. And at the end of the day, if you're not sure, just ask. So look, that was a very quick, short overview. Hopefully that helps. There will be some emails coming out or have come out. So hopefully this presentation will help you understand things better.